What you're about to watch is the preliminary research that my partner and I presented to CGC in lieu of the testing and potential authentication of the Magic and Wizards test print Yu-Gi-Oh cards. By the time you're watching this video, you probably already know that the cards were indeed authenticated after 12 months of hard work. Aitzen and I have well over 100 hours over the past 12 months in researching old Japanese websites and print media in order to dig up information and credibility for the existence of these cards, and this is kind of the conversation or video that got the ball rolling. Enjoy. Hello, my name is Anne. For the past 8 months or so, I've been working alongside Mr. to source and find information on the test print and prototype Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh cards that have been brought to your facility today. The purpose of this video is to kind of cover some of the big ideas that we've uncovered, and this will help us segue more smoothly into a more nuanced conversation regarding their validity or authenticity as items. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the intention of this video, just to be more clear, is to basically give a highlight of each of the three major types of prototype / test print cards that have been brought to you today, and some of the big points of evidence that lead us to believe that they are in fact authentic. Let's take a look at the general overview. Now, first and foremost, we have the Magic and Wizards stamp. This is important because on a good portion of these test print and prototype cards, you will see the Magic and Wizards stamp, as opposed to the standard OCG Yu-Gi-Oh label variant. Now, as we can see from the information at the bottom here, the Magic and Wizards logo was actually applied for copyright on December 3rd of 1998, and it was actually verified in January of 2000. Now, the application of the copyright is important here because in December of 1998, that was just a couple of months prior to the release of the first ever Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh card expansion, Volume 1. Now, Volume 1 actually is home to a lot of the cards that we're going to be showing you today, particularly in the prototype section of things. Now that we have that kind of uncovered, as well as the copyright information supporting the fact that this is a valid thing that exists, let's talk about the three main types of items that you're going to be looking at today. So first, we have the uncut or not factory cut prototype. Second, we have the unintentionally distributed prototype. And third, we have test prints, and those come in both cut and uncut variants. First of all, this is going to be an example of the uncut or non-factory cut item. Here on the right, you can see Mr. Hitotsumi Giant. It's a little bit tough to see because the scan background is white also, but if you look on the top left corner of the leftmost card, above it you can kind of see two little vertical lines that extend beyond the border. That's actually part of a sheet that this Hitotsumi Giant was derived from. Now, I'll actually have photos of the sheet that this card came from, as well as my Silver Fang, which is also in Mr. at this time. We have actual images of the uncut sheet that these were from, and the sheet contains only Volume 1 common cards. Next, we have the unintentionally distributed Volume 1 commons. Now, these are just cards from the set Volume 1 itself that actually feature the Magic and Wizards stamp on the back instead of the standard OCG logo. This example here is actually a card in English called Sparks, and this is one of Mr.'s that will actually be at your facility at this time as well. And lastly, here we have the different varieties of test prints. So the leftmost Flame Swordsman is actually just a production copy of the card that was released. The middle rendition is actually an uncut test print card, and the rightmost copy is a cut test print card. Now, one interesting note is that the cut on the test prints, although it appears to be similar to the factory cut, it's actually cut at a slightly different angle, which you can inspect more in person. And we'll kind of talk about more of the nuance behind these things in a little bit. Let's go ahead and take a closer look. The image that you're viewing right now comes from one of the Shonen Jump magazines, and this is actually the source, one of the first early sources of information that really led us to believe that there's some validity to the existence of these things. Now, as you can see here, there's actually an image of a Volume 1 booster box, and it does have the Magic and Wizards logo on it. Now, here's a high-resolution scan provided by of his Hitotsumi Giant, which was earlier referenced when kind of differentiating the three main types of cards that we're going to be looking at. So let's go ahead and literally take a closer look by zooming in. Now, on the right here, we can just see a factory-cut production card. And on the left, you can actually see here that this is a card cut from a sheet itself. Obviously, the thicker borders are a big indicator too. Now, another differentiating factor between these NFC prototype cards is that they're almost always lighter in color. Interestingly, also, in the case of my Silver Fang, which should be there as well, the lines on the prototype version are actually more precise and clear than the lines on the production copy as well. So a couple of preliminary things that Mr. noticed were the Earth attribute symbol on the Hitotsumi Giant. There's a bit of like a fingerprint on this card particularly, and it's this reddish pink outline across the top. Now, That, in addition to the rosette pattern in the background, so clearly we see that this is a two-layer printing situation, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. But thinking specifically to that outline on the Earth attribute symbol, which is a bit of a fine-tuned detail, we can also see that represented on the NFC prototype. So the fact that this exists is a pretty interesting detail that would, in my opinion, be overlooked quite easily by a counterfeiter who is just trying to rush out a product. Now, next up, let's take a look at the actual letters themselves. So again, this being from the factory cut production copy, you can see when we zoom in, the rosette pattern is very clear in the background of the card. However, the letters on the Hitotsumi Giant's name itself are not subject to the rosette pattern bleeding through, which is indicative of a second printing layer, which is not commonly replicated in counterfeits, especially early on in this time frame. Now, let's take a look over at the NFC prototype and see how the rosette pattern stacks up here. Once again, we can see that there's a very clear rosette pattern in the background of the card, and the printing of the text itself does not fall victim to bleeding through. That's, again, indicative of a second printing layer, which just the technology and expense for that would be quite steep for someone who's counterfeiting cards, not to mention the fact that this is simply a common card from the first expansion, so definitely not a money card. Now, when we're looking at these production cards, the first thing that we can see is a difference in the copyright as well. So if we look over here, on the Hitotsumi Giant featured on the right, we can see an abbreviated copyright. And coming over here on the left to the NFC prototype, we can actually see a more elongated copyright. So that's an interesting difference, including the 1999 Konami that Mr. have more information to provide you with in person as well. Now, looking at the back of those very same cards, if we zoom in on the Hitotsumi Giant from the production line of things, obviously we can see that it's a bit tattered and worn, but here we can see the original or common Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG variant. So we see Yu-Gi-Oh! At the top, we see red lettering with gradient on the Japanese base kind of scripture here, and we see stars in the middle and some more kana down at the bottom with a trademark symbol. Coming over to the right, we see a lot of the same stuff. So we're still seeing Yu-Gi-Oh! In English, we're seeing the Japanese text, but a big difference with the Hitotsumi Giant on the left is, we actually don't see that same gradient. Now, again, if we come back over to the Hitotsumi Giant that was straight from production out of a pack at some point in time, we see it goes from light red to dark red, gradient shift. Now, when we actually come over on the left, the big discerning thing other than the massive Magic and Wizards logo, which again was trademarked in December of 1999, or 1998 rather, we actually see a logo without a gradient shift. So this is just solid red all the way down. Now I'm going to be able to inform you about the various logo changes that have happened over time, most of which actually have copyright submitted at some point in history as well. This particular solid red logo has been seen on many different video games from early Japanese products, particularly the Dark Duel Stories video game had the same exact logo regarding its gradient shift. So that's something that's interesting as well, and that'll be a bit more detailed conversation that we have. Now, again, here we can see that the text appears to be printed in a separate ink layer. The rosette pattern on the border is much more clear than like the opaque black coloring, but this is kind of like when it comes to inking, we don't have the expertise in order to actually unlock a lot of the nuanced details behind that. So we're actually hoping that the ink can be somehow chemically tested when compared to like a production copy of the card in order to get like an extra layer of validity on these items. And that's why we're here today with you. Now, moving away from the Hitotsumi Giant, so that was our NFC card. Let's go ahead and take a look at an unintentionally distributed card. Okay, so first let's go ahead and differentiate between the Magic and Wizards copy and the production copy. So here we can see that the copy on the left is going to be our Magic and Wizards card. The copy on the right is going to be our standard production volume 1 common of Sparks. So let's go back over to the images side by side. So immediately we're able to see that it's the same card, but a little bit of a lighter shading on the left coming from the Magic and Wizards copy. If we go ahead and zoom in even further, now this is an interesting case because when it comes to the name text itself, we actually have a white inking. Now, white is interesting, obviously, because it's a little bit more telling. So if it were in fact printed on just a single layer, then the rosette pattern would almost certainly bleed through a white ink, even if like the black were too strong on the Hitotsumi Giant. Now here we can see on the production copy, as one would expect, that there are in fact evidence of 2 print layers. And if we come over on the Magic and Wizards unintentionally distributed copy, we can actually see that there is no bleed through on the rosette pattern here either. Now, what's also evident is the fact that this Magic and Wizards card is pretty tattered around the corners and edges. The surface has some damage sustained to it. So clearly this was not treated like it was something that was going to elicit some kind of like copious amount of profit at any point in time. The same is true for my prototype and test prints that I have sent along with Mr. both in pretty rough condition, so they certainly were not treated as though they were something that's going to be worth money someday. Again, looking at this Magic and Wizards card as well, we see the elongated copyright, whereas on the production copy we see the much more abbreviated without the 1999 Konami, so another form of evidence there. And let's go ahead and scroll back over to the backs. Okay, so here we're checking out the back of the 2 copies of Sparks that we just referenced. On the right, we can see the production copy. On the left, we can see the unintentionally distributed Magic and Wizards prototype. Now, if we zoom in on the back side by side, we can kind of see like a darker hue from the non-Magic and Wizards card, and we see that the Magic and Wizards version is a little bit lighter. Now, something interesting that we can do here is actually zoom in on the rosette pattern side by side, and as you can see, they're identical. Super interesting stuff there. If we come back down to the Yu-Gi-Oh logo, same as the production copy of the Hitotsumi Giant, nothing revolutionary there. And when we take a look at the Magic and Wizards copy of Sparks, we see more of the same as well. So we can still see that the Magic and Wizards is outlined in white, dark blue in color, and we see the red Yu-Gi-Oh logo without the gradient shift. So very interesting stuff there. And as you can see on the back, it's got some wear as well, so this thing certainly wasn't treated like a treasure, which I think that's an interesting talking point in and of itself. All right, so now we're going to be taking a look at the first set of test print cards. Now, again, the running theory between Mr. is that these were actually primarily, but not exclusively, used in order to be photographed for advertisements within Shonen Jumps and different ads or marketing campaigns of that variety. Some subtle variations that we'll see from time to time are like changes in color, slight shifts in the artwork placement on the card, or what parts of the image itself are actually in frame. But let's go ahead and dive into this first example being Dark Magician, a pretty popular and iconic monster within the anime. So on the left here we have a production card, pretty easily identifiable, and on the right we have a test print that does not have the name featured. Now, one thing that's interesting is I kind of pop back to the advertisement that I showed you earlier. Again, this is from Shonen Jump number 9 from the year 1999. All of these test print cards do in fact have names. Now, whether or not those are actually evident on the cards themselves or if they were photoshopped, we don't have 100% information on that, so it's tough for me to say either way. Just judging from the appearance of the card and how you can kind of see a shine on the ultra rare This Dark Magician, let's suppose that they are on the cards themselves. That would simply indicate that these are later test prints closer to the actual production rather than the ones that we have received and have photographed here. Now again, here we are at our Dark Magicians. As you can see right off the bat, although this factory released copy on the left has some wear, you can see that the corner still pretty much retains the same shape that it was intended to have upon release, whereas the test print card on the right has an extremely square corner. It's not rounded in the slightest, and so that's a big difference that we've noted. Here's what the rosette pattern looks like on a standard production copy of the Dark Magician, and if we zoom in a little bit further, even a bit too much there. If we zoom in a bit further, we can see a side-by-side between the rosette pattern on a test print Dark Magician as well. Now, something that's really interesting that Mr. have spent a lot of hours deliberating, even bantering a bit back and forth amongst ourselves, but something that caused me a little bit of early suspicion was the fact that the rosette pattern is different in structure on the test print card on the right versus the factory produced and released card on the left. Now, something interesting to note, though, is that in this difference actually lies a bit of precision in the fact that the copy on the right has a more precise rosette pattern than the produced copy on the left. Now, if one were to counterfeit, why would they actually use a higher DPI than what was actually released to the mass public? That's a big point that was brought up by Mr. And I think that may carry some merit. This is another situation where ultimately, when we look at the card stock and how it feels, when we look at some different patterns, including like the weight and thickness, maybe the chemical makeup of the ink itself, that could be a bit more telling. However, a strong argument is to be made in the fact that when you have a card on the right that actually has like a much more precise rosette pattern, that would be incredibly hard to counterfeit from this being your base, which is a much lower DPI, larger rosette pattern with less precision. So that's something to be discussed as well in terms of the authenticity of these. Now, the reason that I bring this up too is when we scroll down and we actually look in the text box, you can see that there is not the same evidence of multiple print layers being used on this test print Dark Magician, as was evident on the prototypes of the Hitotsumi Giant, Sparks, etc. So on the test prints, it actually appears as though all the ink layers were printed at once. Now, that to me, again, in the beginning phases of our deliberation was a little bit concerning because it's kind of common knowledge if you study the research that has been accumulated on counterfeits that two-layer printing facility printers or actual production quality printers are very expensive, and that's kind of one of the big identifiers in counterfeit cards for the general consumer is like relying on that multi-layer printing system, whereas like counterfeit cards early on, at least in like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, would be just printed on one layer, even sometimes on like a piece of foil itself, because it's just cheaper and easier to acquire. Now, that caused suspicion for me early on because, again, there's not evidence of multiple print layers. You can clearly see the rosette pattern is bleeding through the characters in the text body. However, again, when we take a look at the DPI, like just the sheer precision of the rosette pattern on this, I think that there's something here. And again, that's more reason why we brought these cards to you to be further examined, because our expertise was sort of like stretched thin here. Again, on these test prints, you can still see the elongated copyright date. We actually have two copyrights here. So we have a copyright 1999 Konami, and then this is just the studio information from which the card was derived. And over here on the actual production copy, we can see that the text actually varies a little bit. So we can see the C in the copyright on Dark Magician is a bit larger than the C featured on the test print. So another interesting subtle detail that we've been able to observe. Now, in the same vein as Dark Magician goes, here we can see a square cut test print with a black text name. Again, we know that Dark Magician was printed as an ultra rare in the Volume 1 expansion, so this name should actually be like foiled. And if we scroll down further on the same ad, we can see more evidence of Magic and Wizards branding, which is never actually released in the starter box. So these, again, are prototype images used before the production of that item itself. Less focused on the Dark Magician here, but here we have another two test prints that are featured, and if you spot the trap hole, you can actually see this hard square cut, which was actually evident on the cut copy of Dark Magician that was presented to you moments ago as well, differing from the rounded edge of an actual production copy. So here we have further evidence that these test prints, so to speak, may have been used most heavily on early advertisements for the game. And again, we see another rendition of the Magic and Wizards branding all over the starter box. One last detail about Dark Magician test prints, the one featured here actually shows a white copyright, which is super fascinating, and is another detail that we've seen be played around with a little bit here and there. And we can actually see the 1999 Konami copyright information on this as well very clearly. So that kind of corroborates the copyright information and these test prints being used as advertisement items. Now, here we're going to take a look at two of the most infamous cards in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, or original card game, the Blue Eyes White Dragon, as well as the Dark Magician. Now, here we can see two factory-released copies of these cards. We've already taken a pretty extensive look at Dark Magician, so let's focus mostly on Blue Eyes, but I wanted to show them side by side for the sake of detail. So here we have two well-loved copies of the cards. Here we can see the rosette pattern of both the Blue Eyes White Dragon as well as the Dark Magician, and we can see that they match up almost identically. We have the same width and everything like that on both artworks. And moving down, we can actually see the differentiation between test prints once more. So we'll go ahead and look at the meeting of the four corners. So on the lower half of your screen, what you're seeing are the actual sharp square corners of the test print cards, and above we can see the rounded corners, even though this one's dented, of production cards. Now, interestingly, if we zoom in a bit further and we take a look at the rosette pattern of the test prints, we can see that while they do differ from that of their production counterparts, we can see that the test prints themselves actually match up. Again, even if we're looking at the Blue Eyes in isolation, we can see that the production copy, while it does have two ink layers, which is not exactly evident on the test print Blue Eyes, we can see that the DPI, or the level of refinement on the rosette pattern itself, is much more precise on the test print, which is very interesting. Now, the whole idea here, and I did mention it with the Dark Magician, but I want to make sure I really hammer this point home, is if you are making a counterfeit, you derive your counterfeit from an image that you have access to, i.e. a card. Well, the quality of your counterfeit can never surpass the quality of the original. if that's the case, well, the question begs, how would a counterfeiter have derived an item that is actually a much greater quality in terms of precision of printing than the original itself? So it leads you to believe that this is likely a candidate for authenticity. The last item that we're going to be taking a look at is the uncut test print card. As you can see on your screen here, we have the Flame Swordsman. All the way to the left, we see a factory-released copy of Flame Swordsman. In the middle, we can see an uncut Flame Swordsman test print, and to the right, we can see a cut test print Flame Swordsman. So we have all three variations of this item, and it's quite interesting when we take a close look. Here on the production copy, which is where we've been starting, and I think it's probably a good place to be, specifically looking at the copyright, we can see the abbreviated version of the copyright that was featured. On the uncut Flame Swordsman, we see the same copyright. When we go over to the cut copy of the Flame Swordsman, the square cut copy with thin borders, we can actually see the much longer version with the 1999 Konami copyright. Very fascinating, and this is a little bit evident of just different stages of development, which is why we are referring to these as test prints and not exclusively advertisement cards. Although we've primarily seen them be used in ads, there's also subtle variations like the copyright itself adjusting over time to become what we know from the production. Now, when we take a look at the uncut copy of Flame Swordsman, we can see, first of all, it's in pretty rough shape. Similar to the Dark Magician and Blue Eyes shown earlier, we are missing the text, the name text. It has not actually been stamped into the card with the foil. And when we actually scroll in and compare the rosette pattern to that of the factory counterpart, we can actually see that they line up pretty well. Interestingly, the uncut test prints are pretty close to the same resolution or DPI of the rosette pattern of the production copy. Now, again, that's further evidencing our theory that these might just be like different stages of development, and that the precision of the rosette pattern itself did depreciate closer to production, likely due to the fact that it'd be cheaper and take less ink to do that. Now, when we compare the uncut test print to that of the cut test print, again, the difference in the rosette pattern is pretty clear. So on this particular scan, this is about as close as I can get to magnifying without looking absolutely insane. But here we can see the clear difference between the cut test print card on the right, the square cut thin border, and here we have the uncut test print on the left, which actually has the factory produced rosette pattern, less DPI, less ink, means essentially lower overhead on the production, which is pretty consistent with that of what we see from major corporations, especially items like this, like at the time cheap trading cards. So one last detail that I'd like to bring up is the rosette pattern and how it relates to the ink on the uncut version of the Flame Swordsman. Here we can see the copyright and defense number or defense value on the production copy of the Flame Swordsman. Again, we have the shorter copyright here and a rounded corner, which is the evidence of the factory produced copy. If we look closely, we can see evidence of multiple print layers. We see the low resolution rosette pattern that was produced in mass, and we see that the zeros and the 6 do not fall through to that rosette pattern. They actually stand independently of it. Now, when we come over to our uncut version of the Flame Swordsman, we can see that the rosette pattern actually does not bleed through on this. Again, further evidencing the fact that this was a prototype or test print that was much closer to production than that of something like this Flame Swordsman, which, although it does have a finer DPI rosette pattern, it does not have evidence of multiple print layers, which means that they were probably tweaking many things and not using as refined equipment. All in all, there's a lot of information that I have gathered over the past 8 months. This is just the tip of the iceberg, what I presented to you today. But hopefully this gives us a good guidepost in order to facilitate a more nuanced conversation and kind of hash out more details like the weight and thickness of the cards, which is more information that I've gathered and prepared for you. But as you can see, there's a lot here, and so we really thought that CGC was the best place to bring these items to in order to authenticate and validate their existence. It's not every day you see things like this, and so we're very excited to be working alongside you in order to authenticate these items. Thank you very much.